Imagine knowing something is wrong and having no reliable way to correct the world about it. Not just once, not in a moment of crisis, but every day. Imagine waking up inside a life where your reactions are interpreted instead of understood, where your sounds are categorized before they are listened to, where your body becomes the primary evidence others use to define you, while your internal reality remains almost entirely inaccessible. Now extend that further. Imagine that one day, without warning, the boundary between your private world and the outside world collapses. Cameras arrive. Voices multiply. Strangers begin to narrate your life. Not cautiously, not slowly, but with certainty. They explain who you are. They explain what you are. They explain what happened to you. And they do it without asking you. This is where the story of Ray Whittaker becomes difficult to hold. Not because it is confusing, but because it is clear in the most uncomfortable way possible. A man existed. He lived a full life in a place most people never see. He communicated in ways that required patience to understand. And then, suddenly, millions of people decided they already understood him. This documentary does not begin with a diagnosis. It does not begin with a label. It begins with a limitation. Ray Whittaker could not reliably explain himself in conventional speech. That single fact shaped everything that followed. Because when a person cannot use language in a way the wider world recognizes, something subtle but dangerous tends to happen. People begin to replace listening with assumption. And once that shift occurs, the person at the center of the story becomes less of a participant and more of a surface. A surface onto which others project meaning. A surface onto which others project explanation. A surface onto which others project judgment. Before any viral clip, before any commentary, before any online discussion, Ray's life was already structured by a specific environment. A rural setting where distance was not just geographic. It was functional. Services were not always immediate. Support systems were not always stable. Medical access was not always consistent. This is not speculation. It is a pattern observable across many isolated regions, where infrastructure gaps quietly shape outcomes long before attention arrives. Inside that environment, Ray lived a life that required adaptation. Not the kind of adaptation people celebrate. Not the kind that becomes motivational language. But the kind that happens quietly, repeatedly, without recognition. If he needed something, he had to signal it. If something hurt, he had to signal it. If he was uncomfortable, overwhelmed, afraid, or unwilling, he had to signal it. And signals are not the same as explanations. Signals depend on interpretation. Interpretation depends on familiarity. And familiarity depends on proximity. That means only a small number of people could reliably understand him. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to maintain a functional connection. Outside that circle, the risk of misinterpretation increased dramatically. This is where the first structural problem appears. Because the wider the audience becomes, the less context exists. And the less context exists, the more likely it is that behavior will be simplified. Simplified into something digestible. Simplified into something shareable. Simplified into something that fits within a few seconds of attention. Ray's vocalizations became one of the most visible points of that simplification, described by many as animal-like, reduced to a single defining trait, repeated, clipped, replayed. But here's the question that almost never gets asked carefully enough. What is the difference between a sound that lacks meaning and a sound that lacks translation? Because those are not the same thing. A sound without meaning is noise. A sound without translation is communication that has not yet been understood. That distinction matters. It matters because it determines whether the person producing the sound is treated as present or dismissed as absent. In environments where Ray was familiar, those sounds appeared to have carried information, not in structured sentences, not in formal language, but in patterns, tone, intensity, timing, reaction. The kind of communication that develops over years of close interaction. the kind that requires attention rather than speed. And that brings us to something uncomfortable. Speed and understanding rarely coexist. The faster a story spreads, the less time there is to verify it. The less time there is to question it. The less time there is to correct it. Ray's life did not become widely known through slow documentation. It did not emerge through careful clinical analysis. It did not arrive through a structured narrative built on verified evidence. It arrived through exposure, through fragments, through images, through reactions. And once those fragments entered the public space, they began to organize themselves into something that felt complete, even when it wasn't, especially when it wasn't. This is where uncertainty becomes critical, because one of the most consistent features of Ray Whittaker's story is not clarity. It is the absence of confirmed medical explanation. There is no universally accepted diagnosis publicly verified in a way that resolves the questions surrounding his condition. That absence should slow the story down. It should introduce caution. It should create space for not knowing. But instead, something else happened. Certainty filled the gap. Online narratives formed quickly. Labels were assigned. Explanations were constructed. And those explanations began to circulate as if they were settled fact. This is not unusual. When people encounter something unfamiliar, they tend to resolve the discomfort by categorizing it. But categorization without sufficient evidence carries consequences. Because once a label is applied, it begins to shape everything that follows. Every behavior is filtered through it. Every reaction is interpreted through it. Every image is reinforced by it. And the person at the center becomes increasingly difficult to see outside of it. Ray did not participate in that labeling process. He did not confirm it. He did not reject it. He could not meaningfully negotiate it in a public space, which means something very specific occurred. His identity, in the public sense, was constructed externally, piece by piece, clip by clip, comment by comment. And once constructed, it became self-reinforcing. The more people saw the same version, the more real it appeared. The more real it appeared, the less likely it was to be questioned. And yet, beneath that constructed identity, a different reality remained. A daily life, a routine, an environment, a set of relationships. Not abstract, not symbolic, real. This is where the physical setting becomes important. Because environment is not just background. It is influence. It shapes behavior. It shapes health. It shapes perception. Descriptions of Ray's living conditions consistently point to a space marked by instability, clutter, aging infrastructure, limited access to consistent hygiene, objects that no longer functioned as intended, a structure that required endurance rather than comfort. This is not presented to provoke shock. It is presented because it affects interpretation. When people saw Ray's behavior, many treated it as isolated, as if it existed independently of environment. But behavior does not exist in isolation. It is always interacting with conditions, with stress, with routine, with limitation. So the question becomes more precise. How much of what people saw was intrinsic, and how much was shaped by circumstance? Without careful investigation, that question remains open. But it is rarely treated as open. Instead, it is often answered immediately. And once answered, it becomes difficult to revisit. This is where the narrative begins to narrow. Because complexity requires patience. And patience is not a dominant feature of viral attention. So the story compresses. A man becomes a symbol. A life becomes a clip. A set of unknowns becomes a conclusion. But something does not disappear in that compression. It remains. Quietly. Persistently. The fact that Ray was still experiencing the world. Still reacting to it. Still navigating it. Still forming preferences. Still expressing responses in the only ways available to him. That fact resists simplification. Because it introduces a contradiction. If he was aware, if he was responsive, if he was capable of recognition, preference, and reaction, then the version of him presented as purely instinctive becomes insufficient. And once it becomes insufficient, the entire structure of interpretation begins to weaken. This is where the story becomes unstable. Not because there is no truth, but because there are too many competing versions of it. And very few of them originate from Ray himself. That is the central tension. A man existed at the center of a rapidly expanding narrative. But the narrative did not originate from him. It formed around him, and as it formed, it began to take on its own momentum. Momentum that did not require verification. Momentum that did not require consent. Momentum that did not require correction. By the time most people encountered Ray Whittaker, they were not encountering a neutral subject. They were encountering a pre-constructed identity. An identity built from fragments, reinforced by repetition, and stabilized by assumption. The question is not whether that identity contained elements of truth. It likely did. The question is how much was missing. And more importantly, what happens to a person when the missing parts are never allowed to surface? Because absence is not empty. Absence is often where the most important information resides. And in Ray's case, that absence is not a minor detail. It is the foundation of the entire story. A man who could not fully explain himself entered a world that did not wait for explanation. And that is where everything begins. Not correction in the sense of fixing Ray, but correction in how he is understood. Because once a person has been reduced to a single visible trait, restoring complexity becomes difficult. And in Ray Whittaker's case, that reduction happened quickly. He was seen. He was heard. But he was not interpreted carefully. So now the question has to be asked again, more precisely. What was actually there? Not what people assumed. Not what circulated. But what can be reasonably observed when the noise is stripped away. The available accounts, limited and imperfect as they are, do not describe an empty mind. They do not describe a person disconnected from his surroundings. They describe something more complicated. Recognition, familiarity, reaction, preference. These are not abstract ideas. They are observable behaviors. And they matter because they contradict the simplest version of the story. Ray responded to people he knew. He reacted differently depending on who was present. He showed comfort in familiar settings. He showed discomfort in unfamiliar ones. He could indicate approval. He could indicate refusal. He could signal agitation. He could signal calm. None of that requires formal speech. But all of it requires awareness. And awareness changes everything. Because once you accept that a person is aware, you can no longer treat their behavior as random. You have to consider intention, even if that intention is expressed in fragments. Even if that intention is difficult to decode. Even if that intention is sometimes misunderstood. Fragments are still evidence. And in Ray's case, fragments were all he had. This is where a critical distinction needs to be made. There is a difference between lacking the ability to communicate in standard language and lacking the ability to think. Those two conditions are often treated as identical, but they are not. And when they are confused, the result is misrepresentation. Ray's communication existed in a different format. Not structured sentences, not precise vocabulary, but patterns, gestures, sounds with variation, repetition with context, pause and response. These are the building blocks of non-standard communication systems. They are slower. They are more fragile. They depend heavily on shared experience. But they are not meaningless. Inside environments where people had spent years around him, those signals appear to have been interpreted with some degree of consistency. Not perfectly, but functionally, which suggests something important. Ray was not unreachable. He was untranslatable to outsiders. That is a very different condition, because it means the barrier was not only inside him, it was also between him and everyone else. And barriers can be misunderstood, especially when observers do not invest time in learning how to cross them. Instead, they stand on one side and make conclusions about what must exist on the other. This is where the public perception begins to diverge sharply from the lived reality. To an outside viewer, a vocalization might sound repetitive, unstructured, even animal-like. But inside a familiar context, that same vocalization might signal something specific. Attention, discomfort, excitement, resistance. The difference is not in the sound. It is in the interpretation. An interpretation requires relationship. Without that relationship, meaning collapses. This is why short clips are so misleading. They remove context. They remove history. They remove the subtle cues that give behavior its structure. What remains is a fragment that appears self-contained. But it is not. It is only understandable within a larger system that the viewer does not see. And once that fragment is detached from its system, it becomes easy to redefine, easy to exaggerate, easy to misunderstand. This is not unique to Ray. It is a general pattern. But in his case, the consequences were amplified, because his entire public identity became anchored to those fragments. And once that anchor was set, everything else was pulled toward it. This is where the concept of agency becomes critical. Agency does not require fluent speech. It does not require complex language. At its most basic level, agency is the ability to express preference, to move towards something, to move away from something, to accept, to reject, to engage, to withdraw. The available accounts suggest that Ray had forms of agency, limited, fragmented, but present. He could resist. He could react. He could express discomfort. He could show attachment. These are not trivial details. They are foundational, because they establish that Ray was not simply being carried through life. He was participating in it, within constraints, within limitations, but actively. And that introduces a responsibility, because once you recognize agency, even in a limited form, you can no longer justify ignoring it. You can no longer treat the person as an object of observation. You have to consider their experience, their response, their boundaries, even if those boundaries are difficult to interpret. And this is where things begin to become uncomfortable again, because recognizing agency forces a question. If Ray could express refusal, if he could express discomfort, if he could react negatively to certain situations, then how often were those signals missed? Or worse, ignored? This is not an accusation. It is a structural question. Because in any environment where communication is limited, the risk of misreading signals increases. And when that environment is unstable, that risk increases further. Ray's life was not defined only by his internal condition. It was also defined by the external conditions around him. Rural isolation, limited resources, inconsistent access to care. These are not background details. They are active influences. They shape outcomes. They determine what is possible and what is not. Even for individuals with full verbal ability, these conditions create barriers. For someone like Ray, those barriers multiply. Healthcare becomes harder to access. Specialized support becomes less available. Consistent intervention becomes less likely, which means development, stabilization, and care are all affected. This does not mean nothing was done. It means what was possible was constrained. And constraints accumulate. Over time, they shape a life. This is where another layer of the story emerges. Resilience. Not the kind that appears in simplified narratives, but the kind that exists without recognition, without framing, without reward. One of the most frequently repeated accounts about Ray involves a snake, a copperhead, a bite, an encounter that could have ended very differently. Instead of reacting in a way most people would expect, Ray reportedly captured the snake, contained it, survived the bite, and kept the animal. It is an unusual story, almost surreal, but it reveals something important. Practical response. Adaptation under pressure. A form of problem-solving that does not rely on conventional pathways. Not refined, not explained, but effective. And that detail matters because it disrupts the simplest narrative again. It shows that Ray was not passive. He was capable of action, capable of response, capable of navigating immediate danger. Not in a way that fits standard expectations, but in a way that worked within his reality. And then there is something else that appears consistently in accounts from people who interacted with him directly. A visible emotional range. Smiling, engagement, recognition, moments of apparent enjoyment. This is easy to overlook because it does not fit the dominant narrative, but it is critical because it confirms something fundamental. Ray was not only reacting to negative stimuli, he was also capable of positive experience. Comfort, familiarity, connection. These are not secondary traits. They are central to understanding any human life. And once they are acknowledged, the story shifts again. It becomes harder to maintain the idea that Ray existed only as a figure of dysfunction, because dysfunction alone does not produce recognizable patterns of enjoyment. It does not produce consistent emotional responses tied to specific people or environments. Those patterns suggest something more stable beneath the surface, something that persists despite limitation. This is where the phrase becomes unavoidable. A mind of his own, not in the sense of independence as most people define it, but in the sense of internal continuity. Preferences that remain, responses that repeat, reactions that are not random. Once that is accepted, the final simplification begins to break down. Because the idea of Ray as purely instinctive cannot hold. It cannot account for variation. It cannot account for recognition. It cannot account for preference. And when a model fails to explain observable behavior, it has to be reconsidered. This is where Part 2 leaves us, with a corrected frame, not a complete one, but a more accurate one. Ray Whittaker was not a blank space. He was not an absence. He was not a single behavior repeated without meaning. He was a person operating within severe limitations, a person communicating in fragments, a person whose signals required effort to understand, a person whose environment shaped how those signals were expressed, and most importantly, a person whose internal experience did not disappear simply because it was difficult to access. Which leads to the next question. If Ray had a mind that could not easily translate itself, what happens when the world decides to speak over it? There's a moment in stories like this where attention stops being neutral. It becomes directional. It begins to move with intent. Not necessarily malicious intent, but not passive either. Because once a life becomes visible at scale, visibility itself starts to change the conditions around it. Ray Whittaker did not enter the public space gradually. There was no slow introduction, no controlled narrative, no careful framing built on verified context. He appeared through exposure, through footage, through reactions, through the kind of attention that does not wait for understanding before forming conclusions. And that matters, because first impressions, once multiplied, become structure. The first widely circulated images of Ray did not come with medical documentation. They did not come with a clear explanation of his condition. They did not come with boundaries. They came with shock, and shock organizes attention quickly. It simplifies. It compresses. It reduces complexity into something immediate, something graspable, something that can be reacted to without delay. From that point forward, the narrative began to build itself. Not from Ray, but around him. Clips were shed. Descriptions were added. Labels were proposed. And each repetition made the structure feel more complete, more stable, more certain, even when the foundation was incomplete. This is where a critical shift occurs. Representation replaces reality. Not entirely, but enough to influence how the real person is perceived. Because once people believe they understand someone, they stop asking if they actually do. Ray became known before he was understood. And that sequence is not neutral. It determines everything that follows. Because understanding requires time. But visibility demands immediacy. And immediacy does not tolerate uncertainty well. So uncertainty gets filled. With guesses. With assumptions. With interpretations presented as fact. The result is a version of Ray that feels coherent, but may not be accurate. And once that version stabilizes, it becomes difficult to challenge. Because it is no longer just information. It is expectation. People begin to look for confirmation. They interpret new material in ways that reinforce what they already believe. Contradictions are minimized. Complexity is filtered out, and the person at the center becomes increasingly fixed in place. This is where the camera changes role. At first, it appears to reveal, to document, to bring attention to a life that would otherwise remain unseen. And in some ways, it does. But the camera also selects. It frames. It edits. It decides what is shown and what is not. And those decisions shape perception. When only certain moments are captured, those moments begin to stand in for the whole. When only certain behaviors are highlighted, those behaviors become defining. And everything outside that frame begins to disappear. This is not necessarily intentional, but it is consequential. Because Ray's life did not exist in clips. It existed in continuity, in routines, in patterns that unfolded over time. But the public did not receive continuity. It received fragments. And fragments, when repeated, become identity. This is where the deeper problem emerges. Because Ray could not intervene in that process. He could not correct the framing. He could not clarify misinterpretations. He could not assert boundaries in a way the public would recognize, which means the narrative developed without his participation. And once a narrative forms without the subject's input, it becomes difficult to realign it later, especially when that narrative is already widely accepted. This is the moment where attention becomes power. Not abstract power, but practical influence. Influence over how someone is seen, how they are discussed, how they are treated. And that influence does not require permission. It operates regardless of whether the person at the center can respond. Ray's story entered that space, a space where millions of people could observe him, without ever interacting with him, a space where conclusions could spread faster than verification, a space where interpretation could become more visible than reality. And once inside that space, something irreversible began. The world took the microphone, and Ray, as always, remained without one. There's a point where attention stops being observation and starts becoming involvement. Not direct involvement, but structural, the kind that changes outcomes without ever appearing in the same room. Because once a life becomes widely visible, it begins to attract response. Some of that response looks like help, money, supplies, repairs, food, clothing, intervention framed as support. And it would be inaccurate to ignore that. Visibility did bring resources that may not have arrived otherwise. It did prompt concern. It did create moments where people recognized that something was wrong and tried to respond. But response is not a single category. It is layered, and not all layers move in the same direction. Because alongside help, something else emerged. Attention as currency. The more people watched, the more valuable the footage became. The more valuable the footage became, the more incentive there was to continue producing it. And once that loop forms, motivation becomes complicated. Is the goal to document, to assist, to reveal, or to sustain attention? Those questions do not always have clear answers. And in situations involving vulnerable individuals, that ambiguity matters, because it creates space for conflict between what is beneficial and what is visible. Ray existed inside that tension. His life was no longer only his environment. It was also content, something that could be recorded, shared, discussed, analyzed by people who had never met him. This is where the issue of consent becomes unavoidable. Consent is not just a formal agreement. It is the ability to understand what is happening and to meaningfully accept or reject it. For someone with limited communication, that process becomes fragile because agreement cannot be assumed. Silence is not confirmation. Lack of resistance is not permission. And without a reliable way for Ray to assert boundaries in a publicly recognized form, the question remains open. Not conclusively answered, but persistently present. Did he understand the scale of attention? Did he have a way to refuse it? Did his signals, if they existed, get interpreted correctly? These are not accusations. They are structural uncertainties, and they matter because they shape how the entire situation should be evaluated. As attention grew, so did scrutiny, not just from viewers, but from institutions. Reports began to circulate. Concerns about living conditions, concerns about care, concerns about whether the environment was sustainable or safe. Details remained partially obscured, as they often do in cases involving privacy and welfare systems. But the direction of movement became clear. Intervention. At some point, the situation crossed a threshold where external authorities became involved. And that involvement changed everything. Because intervention does not simply adjust a life. It relocates it. Ray was reportedly removed from the only environment he had known, taken from a space that, despite its instability, was familiar, separated from people who, however imperfectly, understood his signals, moved into a system designed to provide structure, cleanliness, oversight, consistency. From one perspective, this represents improvement, safer conditions, better access to care, more predictable routines. From another perspective, it represents rupture, loss of familiarity, loss of established communication patterns, loss of relationships built over years. And for someone whose ability to communicate depends heavily on familiarity, that rupture is not minor. It is foundational, because communication is not only about ability. It is about context. Remove the context, and even existing communication can collapse. This is the final complication. There is no clean resolution, no version of events where every outcome is clearly positive or clearly negative. Only trade-offs. Stability gained, continuity lost, safety increased, familiarity removed. And at the center of all of it, the same condition remains. Ray still cannot fully explain himself. Which means even now, the most important perspective in this story is the one that remains the hardest to access. At the end of this story, there is a temptation to decide, to reach a conclusion, to assign responsibility, to separate what was right from what was wrong and leave it there. But that would repeat the same pattern. It would replace uncertainty with certainty before the evidence is complete. So instead, the story narrows to something more precise. Not a verdict, a question. What happens to a person when their life is visible, but their voice is not? Ray Whittaker existed at the intersection of two forces, silence and exposure. He could not fully explain himself, and yet he was explained constantly, by viewers, by creators, by systems, by people trying to help, by people trying to understand, by people trying to react. Each version added something, but none of them replaced the absence at the center, because the one account that could not be fully delivered was his. And that is where the weight of this story settles. Not in what was shown, not in what was said, but in what could not be confirmed. A life interpreted in fragments. A person understood in approximations. A reality shaped by voices that did not originate from within it. So when the attention fades, as it always does, something remains. Not the clips, not the commentary, but the condition that existed before all of it. A man navigating the world without a reliable way to translate his experience into language others recognize. And the final question is not about him alone. It extends outward, because this story is not isolated. It is structural. How many people exist in similar conditions, unseen until they become visible, unheard even when they are being discussed, defined before they are understood? If the answer is more than one, then this is not only Ray's story. It is a pattern, and patterns do not resolve themselves. They repeat, until someone decides to slow down long enough to listen where there are no words. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.